or fear, all of it added up to vertigo. I wanted to chronicle the visible changes in the United States, but more than that, I wanted to somehow capture the subtler subterranean shifts. I grew up with old folks who used to say that if you listen to the little noises an old house made, the hiss of the boiler, the strain of pipes snaking through the walls, the crackle and pop of wood adjusting to weather or weathering from too many people occupying too small a space, it would reveal a narrative emerging on the horizon. I wanted to hear the crackle and pop coming from society's structural alterations. I wanted to put my ear to the private conversations, spurred on by new realities and changing demographics. I had a plan, I landed a book contract, and then I took a left turn. After listening to the changing conversation among the elder African Americans in my family, I wound up writing a completely different book, a family memoir called The Grace of Silence. The election of Barack Obama ushered in a whoosh of candor from the older folks who'd raised me. Proud as they were of a moment that felt like touching America's summit, they couldn't help but think about their own long climbs up the rough side of the mountain. The elders began unburdening themselves by shedding stories they had long kept to themselves. I learned that my father had been shot in the leg by a police officer in Birmingham, Alabama in 1946 while entering a building to join fellow Black World War II veterans. The men were studying the U.S. Constitution so they could answer questions used in poll tests that were meant to limit Negro access to the ballot. Those tests often included questions about obscure aspects of the U.S. Constitution or Alabama state government. As a sailor in the Navy, my father was part of the battle to defend democracy overseas, but he returned to a country, and more specifically a southern state, where democracy was too narrowly defined to embrace Black people. After he left Alabama and migrated north, he never talked about getting wounded during that encounter with the police in downtown Birmingham. He never even told my mother in all their years of marriage. It turned out my mother was also holding tight to a hidden story. I learned that my maternal grandmother worked for Quaker Oats as an itinerant Aunt Jemima in the 1940s and 50s, doing pancake demonstrations at county fairs and Chamber of Commerce events, traveling across a 6-state region in the Midwest with a hoop skirt and headscarf in her suitcase. My grandma Ione wore the costume, but she refused to speak in the presumed lingo of the enslaved that was part of a pre-approved script. Instead, she used her itinerant perch to conduct herself as an ambassador for her people. She served up pancakes using the crisp elocution I always remembered from my childhood. I uncovered news accounts covering her visits to some of those small towns, and in those articles, she told reporters about her work and how she saw her role. She knew she was standing before white audiences, and especially white children who had never encountered a Black woman before, and instead of reinforcing a denigrating stereotype, she used that moment to show small-town audiences something that would blow their minds. Both stories were almost lost in the cavern of locked-away family secrets, buried under shame, angst, and the fierce desire to just keep moving forward. Instead of the book I had intended to write, exploring changing racial attitudes across America, I wound up authoring a memoir exploring how my own family carefully avoided certain conversations, hoping to submerge their pain and set the next generation on a path towards something better. I embarked on a 36-city book tour that kept me hopscotching across the country for weeks. In places like Seattle, Sacramento, Louisville, Des Moines, and Detroit, I spoke in bookstores, churches, and auditoriums, and at book festivals. I had hoped my book and the tour would jumpstart candid conversations about race, but I feared that audiences would cross their arms and go silent if I forced the issue. In my experience, people would rather eat their toenails than participate in a no-holds-barred conversation about race. I needed something to draw audiences in, and I found it by asking people to participate in a 6-word exercise through something I called the Race Card Project. I've always cringed when the accusations fly about someone allegedly playing the race card. It's usually a proxy for "you're making me uncomfortable, so please stop talking," or it's a diversionary tactic used to avoid having to speak about race with any kind of